Welcome back to another episode of My Trauma is Chronic, but I'm iconic. Get ready to meet an incredible specialist in the world of neurodiversity. Allow me to introduce to you Melody Smith, a true champion for embracing the unique strengths and abilities of individuals with neurodivergent minds. With years and a passion for inclusivity, Melody has dedicated her life to advocating for neurodiversity and providing support to those who need it. Through her expertise, she has helped countless individuals thrive by celebrating their differences and harnessing their incredible potential. So get ready to be inspired as we dive into the world of neurodiversity. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Melody Smith.
Amazing.
Great. So now my laptop doesn't work. Okay, yes, it is working. So what inspired you to specialize in neurodevelopment?
Well, I think that I was drawn towards it because of my own different way of thinking, I think, firstly. So I think, psychology is all about, the mind and behavior and the brain. And I've always been fascinated by the topic in general. But I think there's something that drew me towards kind of neuroscience. So I did my MSc in neuroscience and I worked in dementia research sort of before I qualified. And something about understanding how the biology in the brain and the way that it functions can impact or can be layered on top of understanding people's behavior. So understanding, for example, that when we're feeling fearful, that it activates certain parts of our brains, which rewires the way that we remember information, is so interesting to me. Because of the clinical impact of that. So let's say, for example, you've had a traumatic experience, and how that kind of presents itself with the other sensations or other experiences or, other features, layering those on top of each other just gave me a bit of a deeper understanding. So I kind of craved those layers of understanding from back when I did my MSc back in like 20, I think it was in 2011. And so when I went on to training, I think that was always bubbling under the surface. I kind of always try to understand the neuroscience behind the modules that we were learning or clinical work that I was doing. So when I was exposed to, I did a learning disabilities placement in my second year, and I can remember it so vividly because it was in my local area. I knew the area so well, but I remember seeing it through a completely different lens when I started to see it through the eyes of someone with a disability, and the kind of communities and the support that's available, but also what isn't available as well. And, the impact of stigmatization and of, really difficult social experiences that would impact anyone really negatively, let alone if your understanding of the world is not understood by other people. So that it's presented to you in a way that you can understand. And just feeling really connected with that. I think, in my own personal experiences, I've had times where I've understood things differently, or there are rules in place. I don't have a diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental condition, but I think it's something as human that we sometimes we feel misunderstood, or that things aren't communicated in a way that we understand. And really felt connected to how difficult that can make life for people because of the experience I've had myself. And so I think it was my own experiences, a bit of kind of understanding neuroscience, and really being interested in that, and then some of my clinical experience on training that kind of led me to specialize in in neurodevelopment, and of course that was in learning disabilities placement, but I went on to well, in the nature of learning disabilities is a higher prevalence, if we want to use scientific terms, of neurodevelopmental conditions, and so there's a lot of overlap there in terms of the skill set, in terms of the systems around the people that have those conditions and presentations, and so yeah, it kind of just spiraled from there, really. After I finished my doctorate, I went on to work in a learning disabilities service for young people. And it's just kind of boomed from there, yeah.
How do you working with individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Sorry, the beginning of that just cut. Would you mind just telling
Yeah,
me the
that's
question?
absolutely fine. Um, how do you approach working with individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, because I think that the way that I approach working with neurodevelopmental conditions is kind of how I feel everybody could be supported with or worked with. So, you know, just really thinking about that person's individual needs, not only in what they're presenting in terms of the difficulties they're having, but also thinking about what strengths we can draw on, because there are always strengths. Thinking about communication and how people understand things, and checking in with people early on, adapting the way that I do things for their specific needs. So let's say, for example, someone is particularly interested in Harry Potter. You might find, if we're working, let's say, in around anxiety, that we might bring in Harry Potter analogies more. And you may do that with people that don't have a neurodevelopmental condition, because it's engaging. But for someone with a neurodevelopmental condition, it can be more important to do that, because that might be their particular interest. And if it's not about that, it might make it less accessible to them, essentially. And so, yeah, I'd like to say that I work in ways that are kind of similar, you know, and really draw on the person's strengths and their interests, but also highlighting areas that may be difficult, and maybe veer away from those areas if we're not trying to work on them, and really holding that at the center of the work that I do. I guess there is an element of what I do as well, you know, that's around working systemically, and so I may be working within a framework that may be one-to-one, maybe CBT, but there is always quite often a system around people with neurodevelopmental conditions, system of support, and a whole host of experiences around the system of support, depending on how old that person is. And so getting a really good idea of the impact of the level of support over significant, like, what's the word? Crucial periods, is also super helpful as well.
Like amazing that you go with a strength-based approach, because people are like, okay,
Yeah.
like I've no like as a neurodiverse person,
Mm.
I've often found like some people would go with like, this is they're here, they need help, so let's go with the weaknesses. And it's great to see that there are professionals, and there's a lot, like even people that I've met through the podcast felt like, it was always the weakness comes first, it's seen as a weakness, but it's great that you go with the strength-based approach. And what you were saying about the Harry Potter and like, people's special interests, it's great that the care that you provide is bespoke, as all care should be, and it's not like a one
Mhm.
size fits all approach.
Mhm.
What are some of the common misconceptions about neurodevelopmental conditions that you've encountered?
Yeah, so thank you for that, saying all of that as well. So I think um you know, I think one of the really common ones is, you know, where those distinctions lie between neurodevelopmental conditions and maybe even mental health. So I think that yeah, people can often say things that maybe they've been a bit disorganized today, and they'll be like, oh, so ADHD. And I think it's one of those kind of really throwaway comments that people don't quite realize sometimes how ADHD can really impact on someone's day-to-day functioning significantly. It's not just you know, this, do this. No, it's a real kind of challenge. And, just thinking about kind of that strength-based approach as well, often it's about how things are set up, that makes it difficult for people with ADHD to engage with them. And so, yeah, one of the misconceptions can be kind of around the severity or the difficulty that happens when somebody has ADHD and then they have to fit in with systems. It's really hard, really, really hard. Yeah, I think there can also be kind of maybe more in a kind of academic sense. There can be kind of a misunderstanding of what ADHD or autism looks like. So some people might have a really classic kind of view of what autism looks like from films, and that it's the same for everyone, which can't be the same for everyone because we're all different. But within autism, there is a whole spectrum of ways that people can have strengths or special interests or things that they repeat more, so then naturally get better at, that varies across people, and it can be very difficult to pick that out without that really detailed training. And then in addition to that, a controlled environment where you're really delving deep into what each of these things look like. So I think, yeah, it's that can mean that what autism is can be misunderstood or can be confused for other things as well.
I feel like the one thing that doesn't also help with, these misconceptions is the DSM criteria.
Mm.
I feel I feel like at times it can be invalidating because it's like the standardized set of guidelines, used to diagnose what mental health conditions as well as neurodiversity, and it's very like basic. And they're like, oh, you have to meet this to have autism or whatever, and it's like, but it doesn't take into factor people's real like the like in taken into factor. It doesn't take into factor. It doesn't take into consideration the person's experiences and listening to them and truly understanding their needs and challenges. And it's not very open. It's like it has to be these criterias or it's not what it is. But autism is such a spectrum. It has various looks. Like you can't say it looks like that way or looks like this because you can't. There's so many different people that I've met with autism. I did, like, you know what, even as a person with autism and ADHD, I did not realize how different it was until very recently. Like I think like mid year this year, I didn't realize until I met one of my friends in person. She has ADHD and autism as well, but it presents very differently. So that I found really, really interesting.
Yes.
What strategies or interventions, in your experience, do you think is most effective in supporting individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions? We we understand that it differs person to person, they're different people.
Absolutely.
But which is a common route, if there is a common route that people go through?
Well, I mean, again, people with a diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental condition, autistic people with ADHD are just as unique as anyone else. So again, it's kind of that broad approach in that what works is usually what works for most people, but it's about being flexible within how you're delivering it. So, one of the key things in any therapeutic intervention or interaction is about relationship, about building rapport, building trust. It may be that somebody with a neurodevelopmental condition might need more time to do that. But someone without one might need more time as well. So but it may be that that's factored in, and I think it's those, you know, those core things, like building a therapeutic relationship and understanding kind of how to communicate in the most effective way is kind of the first thing to begin with. And then it's about really looking at what the difficulty is. We do have models that I draw from, and so I do quite a lot of parenting work to support parents of autistic children or children with ADHD to know how to feel confident about how they're parenting and to be proactive in managing kind of behaviors and things like that. And so I draw from kind of a framework called Incredible Years, which is used by neurotypical children as well. Gentle parenting and just generally building a respectful relationship with your child. You know, and also kind of a positive behavior support kind of framework as well, which is kind of more around kind of thinking about when people present with certain cues or if there are certain environments that might you know, impact them in a certain way. It's about having a plan around that so we can preempt what situations we might need to, you know, to respond in and how we respond, and being conscious of the fact that there might be meltdowns, there might be sensory overload, and what do we do in those situations. So, you know, really kind of yeah, taking a kind of holistic approach, I guess. You know, one of the other things to factor in as well is any kind of physical health issues and whether that might impact on what's appropriate and what isn't. So yeah, a really holistic but person-centered approach, which makes it really interesting and valuable and meaningful and ever-changing, as for me as a clinical psychologist, but it does make it a bit tricky to explain what we do sometimes.
That's understandable. And you do a whole variety as well. So it must
Yeah.
be even harder. Can you share any like success stories or memorable moments from your work in this field?
Oh, let's have a think. I worked with a parent for, gosh, 7 or 8 months. The parent initially came because they were having challenges with their children. They had 2 children with a diagnosis of autism, and but had very different needs and very different presentations. Interestingly, and this parent initially came around the one child, and later it kind of switched around a little bit, and they were kind of more talking about the other child. But what was really lovely about this case is when the parent first came to me, they were feeling really disempowered. Navigating a school system is challenging when you know, when your children have specific needs. There is a lot of meetings and a lot of advocacy work that parents need to do, and if both parents need to work or just for whatever reason don't have the capacity to do that, you know, there is a lot of worry because it's your child, you know. And what we saw over the course of me working with this parent is that you know, this parent, she really got to understand what autism is. She started to appreciate how autism presents itself for each of her children, how to work with that. So to, again, draw on the kind of strengths or motivations, and to, you know, have them in spaces that work for them, even if that might be different. Also thinking about logistics around that with her, and, you know, how you split yourself in two as a parent whose partner is at work. But the thing that stood out really is this ability, this empowerment to advocate for each of her children when it came to schools. reaching out, being able to reach out to schools at times that are appropriate, being able to ask for support, filling out certain information in a timely fashion so that it can get back to her, or ask for extra time if it was needed, so that the school, you know, knew that it was coming, but we just needed to wait. And it just filled me with so much joy to see her just being a boss in how she was managing all of this stuff, you know, all of this stuff, which is procedural, and it's about, you know, systems and, you know, local authorities and meetings, and not everybody wants to do that. But she was doing it, and she was coordinating it all and advocating for her children, and that was a really wonderful thing for me to reflect on once we came to the end of our work together. Yeah.
It's so amazing. Like, it's so amazing to see people who advocate for their children. I don't know why, but it makes me so happy. Like, I have this friend, she had a child when she was 14, and he has autism. And at one point in primary school, she pulled her child out and she homeschooled him for 2 years until she could get an HCP together, so she could get the, and it's like like you know, parents of neurodivergent individuals, they work so hard. They work extremely hard.
Seriously.
And you know what? I found I was neuro, like, I had autism when I was 15, and I had ADHD when I was 16. So very later on my life, but I was in care, and I still have. I'm in a supported accommodation. I'm on a 3-to-1. Used to be on a 5-to-1. That's a story for another day. Um, and even staff, even if they were with me, like, I don't know, some will be with me for 8 hours, some will be in with me for 6 hours, 12 hours, but I had 24-hour staffing. But they get so exhausted after the end of their shift. And I also have complex mental health needs as well. And they get so exhausted. And imagine doing that 24/7, and also like being with your, like, as a parent. That must be extremely exhausting.
Exhausting, you know, and then you you layer on top of that worry, which is it's a basic anyway for most parents. But you know, layer on top of that kind of like realistic, like warranted, like from what you're getting from the environment, worry. It can really knock out, sorry, I'm going back to my neuroscience thing again, but it can really knock out that part of your brain that just doesn't, it cannot process and plan and think about how to strategize and work your way through it. So it's a double-edged sword, because you've got all this stuff that you're doing, not so much time. So when you do have time, the pressure is there to perform in terms of, what do I do? And the worry kicks in, and it just knocks out that kind of, that kind of problem solving aspect.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like other people also, when they like find like a parent struggling and stuff like that, they go immediately to problem solving. And sometimes you just need to validate. Sometimes you just need a cup of tea, maybe cake. Cake always, sit down, have a, like, just like listen to them.
Yeah.
What sort of advice or words of encouragement do you have for individuals and families navigating the challenges of neurodevelopmental conditions?
It's a very advice. I think, I would always, as a parent, do you mean? Or
Yeah, as a parent or a caregiver.
Amazing. I think that compassion rules. It can be challenging because caregivers have feeling. Everybody has feelings. Stating the obvious now. Everybody has feelings, and
yeah, Danny. Sorry, that was my
your input. Yeah, no, everybody has feelings. So it's just, it can be hard for everyone if, there are differences of two minds meeting. And so compassion for self, number one, compassion for the other person, because at the root of it all, it's not if you're that close to the person and you have a good relationship with them, it's not malicious. It's a difference of meeting of two minds. So if there are any kind of clashes or difficulties between those two people, then just try to go back to remembering, this is just a difference of meeting of two minds, and there is still that care there and that bond there that anchors everything. And we can always work on meeting minds, in a way that works for both of us. So I think that's the first thing, because that connection and that bond is so key for people to feel safe, and for people to be able to go out into the world feeling good about themselves, with self-esteem and things. I think other things, just kind of having an awareness of what a neurodevelopmental condition is, whichever one is most relevant, and identifying how it might present in whoever it is that you're close to. So, for one thing, that in, let's say, ADHD, there is this concept of kind of hyperactivity and wanting to kind of going like you're on a motor, or like a motor, keep going, and that might look different depending on the person. So for one person, that might look like they literally can't keep themselves sitting down, or when they are up, they're moving constantly, or they're picking at something, and you're noticing that they're really finding it hard to keep still. Whereas for another person, it might just look like tapping, or it might be like bouncing your foot. For another person, that might just be because they're anxious. You know what I mean? But being able to look at things again and again, and ask questions as well. Ask how it's being experienced by the person that's being supported, to just get an idea of what that means. And I think getting an understanding of how people are around us, what makes people tick around us, what motivates them, what might make them anxious. Again, it's a universal thing about connecting with people, but maybe it's just that bit more important for caregivers. Yeah.
That's amazing. So we're going to jump into our first segment, where we're going to take a deep dive into the intersection of neurodevelopmental conditions and trauma. We'll explore how trauma can impact individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities, and the unique challenges they may face as well.
Yeah.
We'll discuss the ways in which trauma can emphasize more. I can't say that word, so I'm just going to say emphasize. Emphasize the symptoms more, such as difficulties with attention, social interaction, and learning. And it's important to recognize that trauma can have a profound impact on individuals with the neurodevelopmental conditions, and it's crucial for us to understand and address these effects. But it's not all, doom and gloom. Also, explore strategies and interventions that can help support individuals with these overlapping conditions, from creating safe and supportive environments to implementing trauma-informed approaches. We'll discuss practical ways to meet their unique needs. So, how does trauma affect the executive functionings of individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
Yeah, so it's a really important question, and I think one of the things that I think many people with neurodevelopmental conditions, as you mentioned, are susceptible to are experiences that are traumatic, whether that be because of increased impulsivity and then finding themselves in sticky situations, or whether social situations haven't quite been clear, and so again finding themselves in sticky situations. And I think what really stands out for me is this kind of idea that when those sticky situations arise, there is this shock that must take place, that really does knock out that kind of prefrontal cortex, as I was mentioning earlier. And so, when we're thinking about people with neurodevelopmental conditions and the way that the brain is wired, we know that the brain is wired differently. So the parts of the brain that may be interpreting social cues, or maybe inhibiting them, stopping them from doing certain actions, are brought together within the frontal lobes, to be able to know how to navigate a situation and coordinate in that situation, coordinate ourselves. And so trauma just makes that even more difficult, because the pathways to the frontal lobes are, the memories and the information stored in the memory banks, and the way that the different parts of the brains are coming together because of the neurodevelopmental condition are already different. So when you add trauma into the mix, it again kind of reroutes things, and can make it just that more difficult and anxiety provoking, to navigate for people with neurodevelopmental conditions and with a learning disability. And also there is that kind of difficulty in that understanding as well of the situation and how it's happening. If you think about it, when situations catch you by surprise, you haven't had that time to do the processing, the intellectual processing, to really weigh up what's going to happen. And so, yeah, there's that kind of back foot. And then thinking about aspects of autism or ADHD in terms of emotion and emotional regulation, when things are shocking, then they tend to be quite quick to make our emotions kind of flag, essentially, and we go into a bit of a high alert process, which has a whole cascade of hormones and things that are released into our bodies. But if we're already feeling emotionally dysregulated, or if things that surprise us really knock us, our brains out because of they're not routine, then how that trauma is felt can be amplified for people with neurodevelopmental conditions.
Are there any specific triggers or situations that can intensify trauma symptoms in individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Um, it's a tricky question, again, because of the unique nature of neurodevelopmental conditions. There may be kind of specific evidence on this, that I'm not privy to. But I think, really thinking about that person's presentation, sometimes social situation for autistic people, there are often situations where there are crowds, or kind of high situations that already are high anxiety situations, that if something happens there, they're already on high alert, so it might be felt again in a more amplified way. But I think, sorry, remind me of your question. I'm just making sure that I'm answering your actual question.
Oh, what? Oh, let me think about it. Sorry. Um, are there, are there any specific triggers or situations that can exacerbate trauma symptoms in individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Yeah, again, so yeah, I would base that on individual needs. Um, uh, Trauma and what people have been through, is really key to how it's experienced, but then each individual person's response, based on their strengths and the support systems around them, would vary. I guess it's a very clinical psychologist answer, in that it's kind of a case by case. But as I say, there might be evidence out there, that I'm not privy to, that brings everything together.
That was perfectly said. It is a person-to-person
Yeah.
response. What are some effective strategies for creating a trauma-informed environment that supports the unique needs of individuals with ASD, ADHD, or even learning disabilities?
Yeah, so again, it really goes back to therapeutic relationship. I think, um, as a clinical psychologist, and creating a safe environment. So I think it's important for people with autism, ADHD, to have the space and time to develop that trust. And I think you made a really good point earlier when you said it's just about drinking a cup of tea. There is something about the clinical environment, or making things super formal, that it feels unusual for everyone. It's not kind of a yeah, it's kind of not like a there's no template, if you like. And because it's because most environments have rules, unwritten rules, that autistic people will be aware of um because they've often had to navigate them in other situations and be conscious of them. The rules are not so clear in therapy, especially at the beginning for anyone, even if you try to explain it. So it's important that we explain. Of course, it's important we explain to everyone what the environment's about, but it's sometimes about feeling out that environment and getting familiar with it and creating a bit of a routine within that environment that can help people to open up, and so giving some time, I would call it engagement work, where you're not doing anything specific, in terms of kind of therapy or making changes, but purely about building an understanding and a connection, is one way of supporting the work that we would do. Yeah, and then really kind of being gentle and sensitive in throughout the progress of work as well. Highlighting that it's a very any therapy is challenging, and it's hard work for people, but just acknowledging that if it becomes overwhelming, that that that's okay, and we can work together to kind of bring you back into the room, and taking time to maybe space after sessions to decompress, or having slightly shorter sessions that they're confined and boundaried, and adapting based on the person's needs, is really helpful, I find. Yeah.
Um, how can trauma impact the social interactions and communication skills of individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning that people with social interaction and social communication difficulties may not kind of pick up cues given by other people in the same way, and they may not give the same cues as well. And so there is already differences in what's expected of them in terms of understanding, and what's in terms of given and in terms of the brain and the way it processes facial expressions or situations and environments. I think tying together the different elements of how neurodevelopmental conditions present with the emotional aspect as well. Again, I think it's about that amplification of when situations arise, and that amplification of how feelings are experienced, that really can impact their response to this whatever the situation is. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I'm flagging a little bit because it's a lot of talking. Tell me the
Okay.
question.
Are there any specific therapeutic approaches or that wasn't the last question. Sorry, give me a second.
You will edit this, won't you?
Yeah. How can trauma impact the social interactions and communication skills of individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Yeah. And so, in terms of, so when we're thinking about all of those things and that amplification of the how it's experienced by that person, and then we think about kind of the trauma response, and the idea that it can sometimes mimic autistic traits. That's why when we do diagnostics, we are thinking about kind of developmental history, and one of those things is, has anything traumatic taken place, and has this impacted on their presentation in any way, and how they are operating in the world. And so yeah, in terms of kind of social withdrawal or mistrust, both trauma responses and experiences of people with neurodevelopmental conditions that might come to the fore and compound with each other. And so we might find that people can just become more self-contained, more isolated, which you know is very, very hard in terms of some people really value being able to have kind of support and being able to connect with people regardless of neurodevelopmental condition. And for people that might find that to feel safer and so more, I guess, for want of a better term, happy disengaging from people, it might mean that they miss out on certain things or don't get access to support, you know, or might find themselves feeling, yeah, really isolated, essentially.
Are there specific therapeutic approaches or interventions that have shown success in addressing trauma in individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
Oh, again, I'm not privy to all of the evidence on this. But what I do know is that there is, you know, we're building the evidence base around kind of neurodevelopmental conditions and working with people with neurodevelopmental conditions. I would, yeah. It's tricky though. That's a tricky one for me because I don't really know the evidence base so well.
That's absolutely fine. Um, from your I mean, no, actually, I'm going to ask this instead. What role does sensory processing play in the experience of trauma for individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
Yeah, so sensory processing is really important. So with um neurodevelopmental conditions, um there's often this kind of like what's the word? I can only think of kind of the technical terms, which is hyper and hypo. So people are really
That's
highly sensitive or something. Sorry?
the only ones that I can think of, hyper and hypo.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah,
you
there's kind of this distinction where it's kind of really, really sensitive to something or not really sensitive at all.
in a? I think I would explain it as like hyperarousal. Are you talking about that?
Yeah.
Hyperarousal is when you feel overwhelmed, and it's very obvious in the sensations in your body, in
Yeah.
the thoughts, your actions. Whereas a hypo arousal is when you are quite flat, numb, and it don't feel that much. You're not engaging as usual. There's a disconnection between your emotions, body, and mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and it presents it's so it's so interesting in practice because both hypo and hyper arousal can present as issues. So for example, if someone is hyper aroused by noise, let's say, and they have to go to school and the playground is like the worst noise ever, then that will make playtimes really difficult for that child. And so it's the hyper arousal or the hypersensitivity that becomes difficult for that person. Whereas in other situations, hyposensitivity might be the issue. So it may be that they really, really like loud noises because in order to kind of hear things and to kind of feel satisfied with how that thing sounds, for whatever reason, they need to hear it really loud or really repetitively. And again, that can be something that impacts their environment, which then means that people will be like, this is a bit of an issue for other people in the environment. So yeah, so in terms of kind of how that maps onto trauma, which is I think was part of your question.
Mm.
Um, again, it's if we think about our senses, they are tools that our body uses to tell us about the world around us, and they impact and they influence. They're like signals that influence the whole process of our whole functioning. And so, if there are differences in how people perceive, then the thresholds for those other things happening in the brain cascading, maybe it's certain hormones or maybe it's certain neurons firing, the threshold that those need to meet in order for it to flag as this is something that I feel like I'm going to be really seriously harmed here will change. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that, because, that sound in the playground that's super, super loud to that person may reach a threshold for sound that may tip them into, or close to that region where this is really, really day on, day in, day out, this is really, really, really hard for me, and tip them into this is a traumatic experience, especially if it's they're kind of being forced there, or they're feeling overwhelmed and they're left, or not feeling safe within expressing that for whatever reason, then it can turn into something that's much bigger than just a noisy playground. And I think sometimes, yeah, people can be unaware of just how big of an impact something is for someone with, a neurodevelopmental condition, and not be able to validate it for that reason.
I think a lot of people who are neurotypical, not all of them, most of them, not all of them, but like they don't understand how disabling it can be, how it can just, like, I don't know, if I'm in a really, really noisy place and it's really, really bright, even if I have my sunglasses on, my headphones on, like I won't move, I won't talk, I won't like do anything. And that could be it. Or if I'm in like a more sensory, in a place where I feel like my sensory needs are met, I'm much more social. Um, the social cues still might not be there, but I'm still much more social, much more interactive. Um, and those little changes that may be so subtle for most people, but it makes the world of difference for others. How can educators and support professionals adapt their teaching methods to accommodate the unique learning styles of individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions who have experienced trauma?
Yeah. I think when the first thing that comes to mind is that we really have to acknowledge the environment that teachers are working in. I think that teachers do such an amazing job, and it's such an important job. And sometimes, for whatever reason, it's not necessarily on purpose. Logistics and resources can impact on what teachers are able to like realistically offer. But I think where possible, if teachers can kind of across the board apply things that are helpful for children with neurodevelopmental conditions, then that would be amazing, because not only does it mean that it's just part of the day-to-day, which doesn't kind of stigmatize or isolate or call anyone out, but it also it's of benefit to everyone, really. That being said, there are specific ways that teachers might be able to support people with neurodevelopmental conditions, and it would depend on, of course, the person and an assessment and thinking about their specific needs, which I would do during an assessment process, and even with in follow-up work with people. Allowing time is something that's really commonly spoken about, but it's important that teachers kind of understand what that time might be for. So maybe a child with ADHD needs time because they're not getting their work finished on time, but is it because they are doing a task where they have to read and answer a question? And in that case, can they read the question, or is it that they're just slow to read it? So do they need extra time? And then do I need to now think of ways that I can maybe have a reader, or like speech to text or something, so that when they're doing that task, it's not about them learning to read and answer a question and answer the question, which is like two whole tasks that other people might not be doing, but it's just about answering the question like everybody else. And again, as I say, sometimes it would be great if we can incorporate some of these things for all children, but sometimes children with specific needs need things to be presented in different ways. So this is an example of one. So having a reader or something like that. And I think, you know, in terms of kind of thinking about the things that are maybe more challenging to redirect, you know, sensory needs can be really challenging. They just can come out of nowhere. And then what are you meant to do? Turn off the button to the sensory button? I don't have one. I don't know about anybody else. And so being able to kind of identify early, thinking again of that kind of a positive behavior support approach, thinking early what environments or scenarios might this young person or this person find overwhelming. How much time can we, you know, give to it before we have something else, or before maybe they're able to yeah, go for a walk or whatever it is that the sensory need is. Maybe they need to take some time out of the classroom, or, you know, but having a space for them and an infrastructure for them to kind of decompress if things become overwhelming sensory wise can also be really great in just inviting them and normalizing or validating that that's happening, and inviting them to look after themselves in a way that will hopefully map onto the rest of their lives, which is kind of why we go to school, to kind of learn all these wonderful information, but also to kind of learn how to kind of live life too.
I feel like one of the ways that teachers are not supported is during any, like, it's not during, it's the EHCP paperwork. For
Mm.
those who don't know what that is, an educational healthcare plan.
Mm.
And I feel like it's just a bit of copy and paste from a little different documents, and it doesn't say what the person's needs are in a way that is helpful for schools and educational settings. And
Mm.
I feel like it's great to let a school know what a person can look like, you know, in the most difficult times. But some might
Mhm.
not be present. And that's when I feel like educational provisions will be like, we do not think we can meet the needs,
Mm.
as if
Mm.
it's presenting constantly. And a
Mm.
lot of people, when they have like a commodity of needs, that's when the difficulties come, even when specialist schools can't meet their needs.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, you know, the one possible reason could be because it's created by different parties, like
Yeah.
authority, parents, school, carers, and then, or it could be the limitation of, you know, in terms of resources, time, or available support services,
Yeah.
which can, you know, impact the comprehensiveness of the report.
Mhm.
I think also individuals, they evolve over time.
Yeah.
So I think like a year, like, I know it can be reviewed less than a year if, you know, there's significant changes,
Mhm.
but being reviewed yearly, I don't think that's the most effective way,
Mhm.
as it's not regularly reviewed and updated to ensure it remains comprehensive and meets the changing needs of the individual.
Mm.
But it is a complex process. It is a legal
Yes.
and stuff like that. You have to
Uh-huh.
give credit to them for, you know, doing it,
Yeah.
you know, all in regulations with whatever legislation they need to follow.
Absolutely. It is a very it can be a lengthy process, and it involves as you say, like joint working across agencies can throw up a lot of kind of challenges. And then on top of that, the time needed, sometimes it's just very tricky to, you know, keep things really in a short time frame. And so you know, I guess the EHCP, one of the key kind of key goals is to kind of identify that person's needs within the school, so that the school can put into place something that's going to kind of be in place hopefully for that, for whatever the period is, until the next review at least. And so in order to get all of those things up and running and to see them kind of through, it does take time. But I guess within that um it doesn't stop schools rethinking how they might you know they might use that support that the child is getting. And as you say, you could bring forward reviews. But another thing that I think is helpful and often goes alongside EHCPs is a kind of a profile, like a profile with a picture and things about the young person, things like what they like, where they live, who's in their family, favorite topics at school, or kind of things like that kind of bring in the child's voice. And there is also a part of the EHCP that brings in the child's voice quite purposefully as well, that we can draw on. So I think as professionals and maybe even just generally really kind of what am I going to say, really kind of beefing out those sections and making them meaningful, the bits where the child's voice is heard, and giving that space, which I think is definitely in the HCP meetings that I've been in, the child is often invited at least for a little bit if they can make it, then that's helpful, and then keeping that at the forefront as much as we can. But I think you're right, there are so many sort of logistical red tape kind of things, hurdles to jump through, that sometimes it might not work for specific children, and we need to do things maybe differently for them.
The one thing that I get like worried about is like when people don't have the capacity to understand what's on the HCP report. I like the young person or the child or who anyone up to 25 really, and they don't understand it and they can't dispute things. Like once I've because I'm very involved in my care, and like once I've looked through the whole EHCP report and sent it back, and I'm like, no, I want it redone. It wasn't. It was not great. Still not great, but it's better than before.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like virtual school, like they're really amazing. They do a lot. Like, and I'm like, I get like stressed. Like, these meetings are an hour, maybe even 2 hours. But I get stressed, and they
Yeah.
like, and I'm like, you do this all day, every day. I feel like they should be allowed to go into like early retirement or something like that.
We get that on the record.
Um, uh, what do you think are the specific challenges or barriers that individuals face when seeking trauma-informed support in your experience?
Sorry, say that again. So what do I say at the beginning part again? Sorry.
What's okay? And what are the specific challenges or barriers that individuals face when seeking trauma-informed support?
Yeah, so I think particularly for young people with neurodevelopmental conditions, I think that where things where their behaviors and things that were kind of evidencing that their brains were operating differently may have been kind of around from when they're young. The narrative around kind of trauma um it may get dampened down by just over time how they have developed and how their behavior has been. So for example, somebody who it's maybe has a diagnosis of ADHD, they may have even as a baby been a big crier, and then maybe and then as getting into toddler stage might have been a big scratcher, or do you know what I mean, in terms of how they might have regulated some situations or operated in some situations. And so that can sometimes build up a bit of a negative narrative around, oh, it's just trouble, or something like that. And so that narrative can sometimes kind of downplay or can kind of chip away at somebody's self-esteem, or might lead them to be in situations that are not understood by other people as being kind of still out of the ordinary for that person, because it might be that they've been in so many different situations and scenarios that you're like, oh, not another one. But that for that person, it is the one, or is compounding on those experiences that they didn't really mean to happen before, but for some reason the narrative means that they are in some way at fault, or might have done something wrong to have brought it in some way. And so I think, you know, that interpretation can be really internalizing, can be internalized, and might stop people from realizing that they need the support or that they're entitled to support. I think also, you know, in terms of kind of the threshold for trauma, and the kind of experiences that people have, may not map onto what it looks like for an autistic person and what qualifies as a traumatic experience. Going to a concert could be a traumatic experience for somebody. It really could. It's, you know, so but in terms of trauma services, they may be set up for people who had a road traffic accident, or maybe a head injury or something like that.
That's
Sorry?
not something that's not chronic trauma.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessarily set up for that's the kind of specialism essentially, or the kind of the knowledge that's needed to kind of unpack why that's a trauma for that person, which might prevent them from being able to access the service in the first place. And you know, you mentioned some really interesting points as well about language, and you know, sometimes the language used to describe the traumatic experience might be you know, language that's not familiar to people as describing that. It might be that, you know, they had, I don't know, nails in their heart or something, or butterflies or something, or that they describe, that may not be interpreted as a traumatic experience. It might not be understood, and so might not be flagged if we don't explore it kind of in detail.
Amazing. So what sorry. How can intersectionality of neurodiver fuck, sorry. How can the intersectionality of neurodevelopmental conditions and trauma impact on an individual's overall well-being and mental health?
Oh, that's a big question. So intersectionality between trauma and a neurodevelopmental condition, and how can it impact on someone's overall mental health? I think, you know, I find myself thinking about, and this is the curse of the strength-based approach. I think that when I think about somebody who has been through a traumatic experience, and how debilitating that can be, but then on the other side, how that can give people a real strong appreciation for what's important to them, and how they want to pursue and live their lives to the best of their ability, and maybe even impact other people's lives. I think about how, you know, how resilient, I know it's a bit of a buzzword, but how resilient people who have been through traumatic experiences are, and how they're able to give back so much into the world. But I also think about autistic people and people with ADHD and their strengths as well. And I'm just thinking about the resilience and the resolve that comes with being able to navigate in this world, knowing that other people might think differently, but still being able to do it anyway. And so part of me thinks about that I lead with this kind of strength-based approach, in that there are amazing possibilities beyond the trauma and beyond the neurodevelopmental condition that people who have had those both experiences can offer to this world. And we need to listen. We can learn from these people who have had both. But what we do know is that it's very incredibly difficult to what's the word I'm looking for, function when those two things are present. It can make people get stuck there. It can be a very lonely place, which makes it a bit difficult for people to seek support. And then once support is sought, it can be difficult to get the right support. And I'm sorry, but if I've been in an organization where I don't really trust or feel confident, neurodevelopment or not, I might not want to try lots of times, and so I might get disillusioned by what support there is out there. And so it can become really, life can become really hard. You know, on top of that, you know, there are social aspects to this, you know, in terms of working, you know, having enough money to pay bills, and, you know, and then if they find that they need to apply for benefits, there's so many forms, there's so many people to see. You have to make lots of phone calls and emails, and maybe even go to see people too. And so it's kind of like, it can be very, I imagine, feel very boxed in. And that's no fun for anyone. That's a horrible feeling. So yeah, I think the intersection of the two of them can make us, you know, feel incredibly sensitive and hypervigilant, but also very kind of stuck as well.
How can families, members, no, let me rephrase that. How can primary caregivers best support individuals who have experienced trauma in their healing and recovery journey?
Yeah, so primary caregivers, it depends. So by primary caregivers, you mean like GPs or people that aren't going to be working with them for a particularly long time? Because I guess, yeah, go on, sorry.
By primary caregivers, I mean like parents, carers, or you
Oh,
know, carers, the local authority, whomever.
got you. So sorry, could you repeat the question again? Sorry, because I got it wrong. Who you meant?
What a oh my god, I just deleted it. What
Sorry.
yeah, it's okay, don't worry. I just need to find it on the actual. Oh my god, I found it. I found the document. How can primary caregivers best support individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions who have experienced trauma in their healing and recovery journey?
Yeah, so you know, it comes back to compassion, really. I think there is so much in that attachment bond. There is so much in terms of safety and comfort that is so important to helping us all to regulate ourselves, but that becomes even more important if people have experienced trauma and have a neurodevelopmental condition as well. So I think, you know, but I think it's important just bringing into the conversation more of the neurodiversity. It's important to bear in mind how that person likes to be comforted. So for some people, they don't necessarily want to speak. So if that was the case, just being conscious of those times when they just don't need that. But also, if you know, but also kind of, I guess if it depends on if we're talking about a parent or a partner, and things would be different for both. But you know, if there are times where that are safe, that you could carve out to maybe ask questions or check in about things that feel safe for that person, that might be kind of how to do it. But just generally trying to create an environment that is mindful of their triggers, and that helps them to feel safe and contained. And again, yeah, so just drawing from kind of attachment and attachment bonds, and all the wonderful kind of happy emotions, happy hormones that are set off, like oxytocin, when we are kind of comforted in a way that works for us. And I think, you know, just you know, in terms of kind of helping them to seek further support, if that is what their wish, or if that is kind of, if it's an adult, or if it's a child, if they can do that, if you can do that with them. So advocating for them, but remembering that advocating isn't about putting forwards necessarily your own view. It's about representing their needs and their interests, and thinking about, if they were to kind of answer, or, if this was a perfect scenario for them, what would they ask for, and checking with them privately if that feels better, so that they can make their wishes kind of clear, as well.
Great. So we're going to go into our second segment. We're going to explore the power of early intervention when it comes to neurodevelopmental conditions. We'll dive into the role of early identification and interventions in conditions and ASD, ADHD, and learning disabilities, and examine the long-term benefits it can bring. We'll discuss how early interventions can help individuals with these conditions by providing them with the support they need at a crucial stage of their development, from targeted therapies and interventions to specialized educational programs. We'll explore the various ways in which early intervention can make a significant difference in the lives of those who have these conditions. And by addressing these unique early on, we can help individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions build important skills, improve their social interactions, and enhance their overall quality of life. So let's begin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. What are the key indications that professionals look for when identifying neurodevelopment conditions in early childhood?
Yeah. So it varies. It very much varies, depending on the person. I've said this so many times, sorry. But and yeah, one of the first things when a person is young, if it's flagged young, is delays in development. So we're talking about like speech and language delay. So maybe not being able to kind of say words or put together words or sentences at an age you might expect them to. Sorry, my phone's things like walking, or crawling or sitting up slightly later. Things like toileting and toilet training. They might be delayed in people with neurodevelopmental conditions or learning disabilities. And that's kind of one of the first things that gets flagged for parents. But, in the nature of development, sometimes children, they do develop, like in a similar at a similar rate to their peers, or they might catch up. And so some children with neurodevelopmental conditions won't get picked up at that stage because it's just not showing up for them. It doesn't necessarily mean it's more or less severe or going to impact them more or less necessarily. It just doesn't get flagged at that time. And so those are the kind of things that we pick up on. The next time really that things are flagged are when they might start a new like institution or like a nursery or play group where social interactions become even more important, but also, they're being kind of judged by people outside, and you get like a stranger's eyes on your child. And in those situations, you might find that maybe there's differences in play or differences in relationships, and maybe they're a bit rocky, or maybe they aren't picking up certain tasks, certain activities, intellectual activities that other children that might lead a nursery teacher to flag to the parent. Oh, they tend to play by themselves a lot more than other children. Have you tried X, Y, and Z? Or maybe we can work on helping them to integrate, or with other people and play. There might be that kind of thing going on. Or you may have them saying, maybe you could get them assessed because they're showing some signs of neurodevelopmental condition. But often it's very challenging to diagnose any neurodevelopmental condition before really the age of 4, 5. Anything earlier than that, it's very hard, very, very hard, because you think children's developments fluctuates, and they learn things and then they might stop doing them for a bit, and or they're just constantly changing, so there's no kind of constant presentation that you can kind of hang your diagnostic label on. And so yeah, anything before kind of 5, and even at that age, it's kind of like it can be quite challenging. So then yeah, sorry.
It's really crazy how it's like, like I think like what age would be like ideal for diagnosing someone? What age do you think is like, they've developed enough where they're like, not changing as much or as frequently? Um, or yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question, because in my opinion, the fact that we need diagnostic labels immediately creates a bit of an issue, because of, it's a construct, so it's not really a tangible thing. But we do need, I think, my personal opinion is that we do need those constructs, because if we don't, then how do we make sure that people who are being disadvantaged by the way that society runs that things are equitable for them? So off the back of saying that, one of the difficulties with diagnostic labels and when is the right time to get a diagnosis is that one of the key things behind diagnostic labels is a kind of some sort of challenge or difficulty or some sort of problem. Yeah, I guess from the perspective of abnormal psychology, like something's going wrong here. And so by its very token, the way to get diagnosed is if there are significant impact on functioning. And so really the ideal time to get diagnosed by the diagnostic label is pretty much as soon as we're realizing that it's causing impact on functioning. Of course, there are logistical barriers around that because of availability of services and needing to get certain assessments done, and then there's a process and getting reports and things like that, and then for that to then translate into actual support is another piece of important work that needs to be done. It can make it really hard, and it can make the whole thing very hard for people with the neurodevelopmental condition, because all the while they've already been coping as well as they can before it came. And it's so impactful that I can get a diagnosis. So do you see why I kind of had to say by design, the fact that we need diagnostic labels, it's tricky. It's tricky. It's never early enough. Yeah.
How does early intervention impact the trajectory of individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities in terms of their academic and social development?
Well, I think it can impact very significantly. Number one, I think that comes to mind is the stigma that people with neurodevelopmental conditions endure before having a diagnosis is phenomenal. And that's without the label, but that's just because of just behavior and just operating in a way that feels comfortable and that being judged by other people. And so if there is a way of understanding that behavior, that can be really liberating for people, because not only does it all make sense now, but I got a tribe and it's there over there. It's not you, they're over there, which is nice. So, most people want to feel like, they've got a bit of tribe. How you operate within that tribe might be different. And that's perfect, because that's your tribe. Do you know what I mean? So I think one of the key ways is, reducing the impact of that stigma on people's self-esteem. Self-esteem is so important because we all have something to bring, and it just can block, self-esteem can really block people's gifts, which is a real shame, and we all miss out because of that. But also in terms of kind of academic development, because that's part of school as well, you know, not having those adaptations or accommodations in place compound how challenging school is. So if you remember the example I gave earlier about a child who is sitting and trying to answer some questions, let's say they're maths-based questions, and they've got to read there, they've got to work out the answer, and then they've got to write it over here. They've got to read that, work it out on a calculator or abacus or something, and then they've got to write the answer. If that child, it finds the reading of the question and working out the abacus challenging already because of the process of holding the information in the brain and looking here, but I now have to hold it even though I'm not looking at it, that's hard. That's a learning process of being able to remember that information. For some people, that's not a learning process, and that's great. But for some people, it truly is. So now if you want me to hold that information that I'm looking at there, to look at this, to then manipulate it, to then generate a goal-directed answer without becoming distracted, and then to handwrite that down, it's a lot of layers to that. It's a lot of executive functioning processes that are in place that some people might take for granted. Other people, it's a deliberate process. And so by that, having that dual task, you're making the task much more challenging for people with a neurodevelopmental condition to learn how to do that calculation. So if I haven't learned how to do that calculation because it's taking me twice the time, how am I doing that lesson tomorrow? Because that lesson assumes that I know this, and I don't, because I was working on trying to remembering that number and putting it over here on an abacus or something. Sorry, I'm being really old-fashioned and using the abacus, but you know, it's just one of those things that, you know, if we can intervene early and separate those two tasks out, so now you can have the question read to you and you're just calculating it, and you can use your head because you've got a special kind of ability to calculate numbers, because this could happen. This could actually happen. It's because the number is there and they're having to copy it, that puts a barrier. The moment you take out that need to copy it, the child is like, zoom, answer the questions, and you're like, whoa, I didn't realize you were that good at maths. Why am I giving you an abacus? I'm just making it more difficult for you now. So you can access the gift, which means they learn the skill and they can learn for tomorrow. And you've got that strategy as well that you can use tomorrow, which will make them quicker again. So the earlier you can get that those structures in place, you can start to compound that learning, which will stand them in good stead for when they go to secondary school and the learning gets super, super tough.
What have you noticed, in the parents or primary caregivers that you work with? Let me say that again. I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh shit. What are some of the challenges or barriers that families may face when seeking early intervention services for their children with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
Well, yes. Yeah, very good question. So I would like to go out on a limb and say there is an overall shortage of services for people with neurodevelopmental conditions and learning disabilities. I would like to say that I was fortunate enough to work in a learning disability service, but they don't exist everywhere. Sometimes learning disability services are just a part of general CAMS or just a general service, especially for children, sorry. Often they have them for adults, but especially for children. And that's okay. It's okay. But I guess when you have a learning disabilities service, it attracts certain professionals and it attracts certain service users as well who are looking for a specific service that's going to work for them. And so, yeah, I think one of the barriers is access to kind of specialized services. Within that, I think there's a lot of waiting happening, unfortunately, at the moment for assessments. I think that there's been massive awareness happening around neurodevelopmental conditions, and people are asking questions about whether they have them and are meeting threshold for a assessment. And what we're finding is that we don't have enough clinicians to do that assessment work quickly, in a robust way that meets the criteria. So for example, an autism assessment can take 2 clinicians the whole day, and that's not uncommon. Just what it is. Yeah, it's just what it is. And I mean, personally, it's really nice for me because I can delve into that person and just be in their presence for the whole day and just think about them, and I don't really have to kind of split my attention. So for me, that's really nice. But it's not really about me. There are lots of people that are waiting for this service, and so there are things being done behind the scenes to make this more efficient and more realistic for us to meet the need as a professional mental health professional group. So lots of work being done behind the scenes to kind of reduce waiting lists and get people trained up, get trainings out. That's something that we're doing. I do within my private practice, just to try and do a bit, do your bit for every for the group. But yeah, I think it's there aren't so many specialized services, and there is a bit of a skills shortage, which means that waiting times are quite disheartening for people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I've learned that some people on a waiting list for autism and it's 5 years long, and I'm like, and it's so, I don't know, so it must be discouraging for them, being like, what's the point? In 5 years, so much can happen, and there's like, and then even then getting into support, it's like, you know, getting into support, that's another waiting list. I feel like there's so many barriers and so little services.
And all the while, you're expected to live life.
Yeah, with minimal support.
Yeah.
Until something either life-threatening or drastic happens for somebody's attention to be somebody's attentions to be drawn, then be like, oh shit, this person needs help. And then a local authority will be like, okay, then we need to go privately then. It will be quicker. That's a 4-month waiting list instead of a however long it is. And it's like, really, why does so much risk needs to happen for shit to get done? It brings me frustration. Like, but like as a looked after child, I forgot I turned 18. As when I was a looked after child, like, because the local authority is responsible for us, we get like these assessments done so quickly, and like, and we're lucky in that aspect. Or if you're sectioned, they see you every day pretty much. There's people like observing you and stuff, and you get assessments done really, really quickly. And it's like there's always, and it's like even then accessing support, that you can't like fast track it, which is really like frustrating. And yeah, and there's like what, like according to the research, with early intervention, that plays a crucial role um in supporting individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions. Like, people usually do applied behavioral analysis, ABA, early start Denver model is the ESDM. I think Americans use that as well. And then speech and language therapy. Yeah, I was like, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, and like social skills training. And like that, and it's like, and I'm like, those can be effective, but how effective is it when somebody's past their formative years?
Absolutely. So yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's tricky. I guess it's tricky. My main post follow-up work is with children, parents. But we often talk about kind of the strategies that we use, that I use in the kind of framework that I call the STEAMA method. Um, that pulls together other models, and that can be applied regardless of um, age and regardless of kind of the person, essentially, because they are key ways of understanding and connecting with the person, and it's kind of fueled from this attachment kind of basis, this kind of idea that we want to emphasize the bond at all times, between the caregiver and the person who's being cared for. But often, maybe as adults, that isn't quite the case. It's just people in a relationship as well. And so through the STEAMA method, because I had a similar kind of perspective, it's like, okay, well, there are some specific scenarios where you might use positive behavior support, or you might use other frameworks, speech and language therapies, things like that. But then what about all of these things kind of place the change and the need for change within the person who's being diagnosed, a lot of them, and we're doing things to them, where they're having to show motivation and kind of bend to society, and taking a kind of double empathy kind of perspective, which kind of teaches the theory that kind of teaches that you know autistic people may have been described as not having empathy or theory of mind, but that actually
That's it.
people don't understand what's going on for autistic people as well. So how come that's a problem for autistic people, but it's not a problem that people who don't have autism are not seeing what's in an autistic person's mind. So this idea of double empathy means that we're just not understanding each other, and that comes from both sides. And so I really like that theory and that perspective, because it balances the playing field a little bit. So through the STEAMA method, we're using an approach that essentially talks about the functions of why people behave in a certain way, and it puts the onus on the caregiver to alter their responses based off of the need that's been expressed by the behavior. So through that method, we're teaching people how to identify the function, whether it's sensory, whether they want something tangible, or they're trying to get their hands on something, whether it's about escaping a situation, whether it's about needing or wanting attention, whether it's about an emotional regulation thing going on, or whether it's about two people relating to each other. That's what the STEAMA stands for. And then within that, we help them to understand how spending time and one-to-one relationships can help us to unpack a bit more what's going on for that person, and how we can essentially fill the relationship with goodness, so that when clashes do happen, we've got that goodness, those roots to fall back on, as I was talking about before. How we can think about kind of the way that we talk to people, the language that we're using, with their specific presentation in mind. So maybe, they're autistic, you might need to refer to them by name first and do that consistently. But it's not just about doing it, it's about understanding why for a caregiver. Because once they understand it's not just a rule, but this is how autism works and this is why, then they may be more likely to do it. And we have various kind of sessions where the therapy, if you like, the intervention is with the caregiver and not so much the person who's being supported, so that the onus is a little bit on them to manage the way that they're behaving, which will get a different response from the person that they're supporting. So yeah, that's how we kind of leverage from evidence that's out there, and frameworks that are already out there, and we adapt them for people with neurodevelopmental conditions and learning disabilities. Yeah.
I think it's like, if, and what you said just highlights the There are delays in accessing specialized service and the frustration caused by long waiting lists.
Hmm.
And, with various therapeutic approaches,
Hmm.
like even getting access to that is
Hmm.
long. Diagnosis of neurodevelopmental conditions can have like significant impact on on somebody's mental health. It can lead to feelings of confusion, frustration, and even isolation. Without a proper understanding of their condition, individuals may struggle to make sense of their experiences and face challenges in various aspects of their lives. The lack of a diagnosis can also result into a sense of not fitting in or being misunderstood, which can contribute to low self esteem and anxiety. Additionally, without early intervention and support, individuals may miss out on crucial resources and therapies that could have helped them navigate their conditions more effectively.
Hmm.
Um, so, what are some common mental health challenges that individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities may experience, and how can we effectively identify and address them?
Yeah, so very, very good point. So I think, your point about um diagnosis and it being delayed is a very, very good one, because what we can find with people who are diagnosed quite late in life is that they have built strategies around navigating life, and usually have, very effective ones that have helped them to thrive in an environment, in environments, various environments. But at that, it's typically when the environment becomes more challenging anyway, or that is of a kind of places more demands on individuals, that it can become really, really difficult for those strategies that have been put in place to work. And so for that reason, because the environment is difficult anyway, and typically the person usually is able to figure it out, that can hide some of those kind of typical characteristics of neurodevelopmental conditions. Typically, with a learning disability, they're picked up quite early, because it shows itself in school in terms of, how quickly that person is able to pick up academic information. Um, and but on the milder end of things, it may be that they're missed because, perhaps at school they're still learning, but perhaps the rate is slower than the rest of their peers, but not slow that people wouldn't pick it up. And for people with a learning disability, we're looking at intelligence essentially across various domains. So we're looking at their verbal comprehension. We're looking at their ability to make patterns and put those together. We're looking at the speed that their brain processes information. We're looking at how much information they can hold in their memory, and then how they might be able to manipulate it, or how quickly they're able to do that. And so we're looking at all of these different domains and seeing, we're testing them with tasks and sort of games or challenges, and essentially scoring people in how they do in those tasks. And they're very standardized. The way that we as psychologists deliver them, they're very standardized. So we try and deliver them in exactly the same way for every person, so that we're testing people, we're giving people the same challenges. So when we look at the scores, we can compare and see how near or far people are from what we'd expect. And so, yeah, we test those different domains or areas of brain functioning, and we put all of them together. And what that does is it creates something called a composite score. The key one that we use is called the full scale IQ. And that gives us essentially a number that brings together all of the different elements of cognitive functioning. And there's a specific cutoff score around about that you would think you would give a diagnosis. you know, it's back to that kind of conversation about diagnostics and scores, and sometimes they're not they're not valid in real life situations. And so we're not just looking at that, we're also looking at their abilities to function in day-to-day life. So looking at whether they're able to dress themselves, whether they're able to make a meal, whether they're able to go out and buy something at the shops and calculate the right change, whether they're able to build relationships with other people, things like that. So we're looking at those two together, and just generally their development as well, because, you know, we need to rule out any other things like maybe, I don't know, brain injury or a trauma. And we look at all of that information and make a decision about whether somebody has a learning disability or not. And it's all kind of all pulled together in a formulation, ruling out other potential explanations as well. For neurodevelopmental conditions, you know, I guess the two key ones are ADHD assessments and autism assessments. So they look slightly different. They're similar in that there is a kind of developmental history that's taken. Same would be for a learning disability assessment as well. Yeah, and all three types would also have kind of information that you would gather from a family member or across different kind of settings, just to assess that the presentation that we're seeing isn't just restricted to one scenario or setting. And then there'd also be kind of diagnostic tests that go with ADHD and autism as well. So with ADHD, the key things that we're looking at is you know, history from an informant, or to tell us kind of whether those autism traits are present. We're looking at sorry, am I talking about autism or ADHD?
I
I've
think you were
crossed over.
talking about ADHD
Yeah,
last.
then I've crossed over to autism. No, with ADHD, you're looking at kind of yeah, so information from a family member, you hopefully somebody that's known them for a long time, because we're looking at information sort of before the age of 12, and to see whether those kind of ADHD traits are there. And also we're looking at kind of an assessment kind of tool that we use called the Connors, or a kind of more questionnaire based tool that looks at the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD and picks out whether they're present, and also kind of medical history as well. Risk assessment is another important part as well. So thinking about things like whether there's kind of drugs or alcohol that might be influencing behavior, as well as kind of just generally the impact, if ADHD is there, what that might have on the person and their home environment. So those sort of things are important too. And again, we bring it all together. We look at the diagnostic criteria, and we check that people are meeting the threshold, so they have enough of those characteristics and traits across the diagnostic criteria. For ADHD, we're looking at hyperactivity, impulsivity, and attention. So we're looking at the amount of traits across those kind of core areas to make a diagnosis. And I should say as well, with the diagnosis of ADHD, you could either have, there are three different types, different types. It could be inattentive, or it could be hyperactive and impulsive, and they're two different types. Or it can be a combined type where both hyperactivity and impulsivity and attention affects that person equally and significantly. And then with autism, the process is slightly different after that kind of developmental history stage. I mean, of course, we always do a risk assessment as well, but we are looking for kind of a robust information about the person's social skills and social interaction skills, any repetitive interests, and their social communication skills across the lifespan. In particular, we want to look back to around the age of 4 or 5 if they are kind of older than that. And we're looking at it kind of currently and when they were younger as well. And yeah, so we get information from a family member, hopefully, who's known them since they were a child. We also do an observation of the person or speak with the person about their about those kind of traits of autism. And again, it would be about looking at the diagnostic criteria and checking, you know, quite meticulously whether there were examples for this person across their lifespan of those autism traits as well against the diagnostic criteria.
So, how can we ensure that these individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities have the appropriate have access to the appropriate mental health resources and support they need?
So this is after people have a diagnosis?
Like in the process or even afterwards.
Mm. Yeah, so I think there's just a general need for more people. I think we have such a shortage of clinicians and services that I think are is really being worked on behind the scenes, kind of in mental health space at the moment. There's a lot of kind of talk about the shortages of medications for those who choose to have medication, or just people assessing generally. So I think, you know, it would be great if we could have more people who were taking an interest and was getting upskilled and trained and working in this area, delivering those groups, and kind of more kind of having more contact with people. I think there's, you know, a lot of resources out there, but perhaps there might be a way to kind of be more kind of targeted, or maybe have more available in schools, or in places where people might come up with challenges. So, for example, in the workplace, um, universities, yeah, and I think one of the things we were talking about last time is, you know, just kind of doing things in the community as well, not kind of making it just for people with neurodevelopmental conditions to kind of seek out and find, but if this information was just presented as, routine information, I think we would go a long way.
And what role can schools and educators play in providing effective support for students with these difficulties in terms of their social, emotional, and mental health needs?
I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I feel like this is probably a very typical answer, but I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, reflective spaces for professionals. I think that, you know, we are all trying our hardest to be inclusive and to be thinking about equality and diversity. But we all also have a history. So I think it's important for us to be very frank and real with ourselves, in that there are things to unpack and learn about the world, based off of, you know, the biases that we are quite useful in lots of situations, but in some situations might make things less accessible to some people. And so I think there's, yeah, maybe a lot to be said for having reflective spaces for, you know, teachers, staff, and I'm aware of these things happening, but I wonder if there might be kind of focused reflective spaces, maybe around supporting particular children, or around a process of doing a EHCP or something like that, that, you know, can help to unpack some of the pent up feelings that can come out of, you know, working in the way that teachers do, because they, you know, I said before, they do a really good like a hard job sometimes, but sometimes having an outlet for them to be supported can give rise and give way to strategies and, you know, creative thinking and things.
I feel like that's why, a debrief before people think debrief needs to happen um, after like an incident, but it's good to have debriefs like at the end of the day or at the end of sessions, because and I feel like people fail to understand the importance of having a debrief and what impact a debrief can have.
Yeah.
What are some potential barriers or challenges that individuals face when seeking mental health? I've already said that, didn't I?
No.
Yeah. How can we promote early intervention and prevention strategies to address mental health challenges in individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
I think there's a lot of amazing work being done by people on social media. And I think that there is an awful lot out there in terms of information. But I think maybe it's about making sure that that information lands in the hands of the right people. And so I do wonder whether, I mean, this is going to sound a bit, I don't know, again, predictable, but, just having funding to, and a unified kind of committee, maybe on a national scale, might help to, what's the word, centralize and give power to a campaign or and a message, a unified message being sent out. You know, maybe it's like, me thinking of this utopian place, but there are campaigns about things that do go out. I suppose there is a question around kind of who might invest in something like that, and maybe it's a school campaign, or something that's something that's kind of bolted on to something that's already happening, to make sure that it also happens alongside that. I think certainly thinking about how people can come together and having a bit more unity. So I think there's absolutely things being done, but I think it's about kind of unifying things maybe a bit more now.
What are some of the potential barriers or challenges that individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities may face when seeking mental health support, and how can we overcome them? Is it more of a wide, I feel like it's more of a wider issue. Like, central government, what they said in their autumn statement wasn't necessarily helpful.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. It's I agree that there's a wider issue. And I guess speaking about people with neurodevelopmental conditions, I like to think about strengths, as well as kind of thinking about kind of areas that they may face additional barriers or might find challenges. And I think that, coming from a strength-based kind of approach, I think that people with neurodevelopmental conditions can be incredibly justice driven. And I think that there's a lot that we can take from the community, actually. So I guess I'm thinking about how we co-produce a bit more, and draw on expertise, and also for people in positions of power to be able to relinquish some of that expertise and have sort of like a shared space, or making sure that spaces are accessible and meaningful. Which, again, I think, there's a lot of good work being done, but I wonder whether there's more space for that to kind of support people with neurodevelopmental conditions and learning and mental health difficulties.
What are some important considerations when developing individualized support plans for people with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities to address their unique mental health needs?
Yeah, being formulation driven. So when thinking about when thinking about ADHD and autism, there are these diagnostic criteria, but within that, there are specific examples in how it will present for people. And some of the things that, will meet the criteria will be areas of barriers or challenge, whereas others will be strengths as well. So, sorry, I've forgotten the question. I've lost the thread of the question.
What do they need to keep in mind when creating individualized mental health plans?
Yeah. So what you don't want to do is to be formulating just off the back of this. These are the kind of the things that are present in ADHD. So therefore they all need to be addressed. Actually, what we can do is we can leverage from the positives and the strengths. So again, thinking about the strengths that the person has and how we might be able to utilize them. So let's say, for example, a child getting out of their chair frequently during a classroom can be seen as something that's not desirable in a classroom, but all of a sudden that can become desirable if there is like a pencil monitor needed, and that child now has a reason to get out of their chair and to hand out a pencil. So really thinking about their strengths, thinking about areas of difficulty, or where the areas of difficulty are, and trying to reframe those specific scenarios so that it contributes to an overall kind of positive experience, particularly in the environment for that person. I think it's really important to just be very person-centered, and to think about their life and where the difficulties are arising.
Beautifully said. How can we ensure that mental health professionals and practitioners are equipped with the necessary knowledge and skills to provide effective support for neurodivergent beings?
Well, you got me thinking there about statutory and mandatory trainings and teacher training days. I know that there are kind of good trainings on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Is very much a statutory and mandatory training. So I think that's really excellent. I wonder whether there is kind of again space for discussions around kind of these trainings or themes that come up that can further that learning. So that's another key kind of benefit of having these reflective spaces. They're not just about processing things, but they're also about us all learning together. So yeah, in addition to kind of the kind of EDI trainings, maybe having, even if it's during an away day or a once a year teacher training day, having that as kind of more of a prominent topic could be helpful. Yeah, just a suggestion.
So we're going to go into transitions to adulthood. So you work with children and young people. You don't work with adults, but you must understand from through observations or through experience how difficult it is for people to transition, and how shit the sport is as well. And it's not the exact same. And I love how, the opinion of the system, whether it is directly said or indirectly said through the way that it works, is your needs automatically change the day before you're 18 and the day that you're after 18. And it's very much doesn't.
No.
So sorry to break it to you, but it very
Of
much
course. You're telling me you didn't wake up when you were 18 and feel completely different? Wow, that's
like 50% of my
sarcasm.
needs were just gone.
I know, it's so challenging. And I think as you were saying that, I found myself feeling like, gosh, I would really like to just kind of lay my position on the table and say that as a professional, I've seen what that looks like, but I'm not sure I could quite fathom how that feels to a person going through that, and their family, and or carers, or and parents and people around them. I think it's so challenging because we know that transitions are difficult times for anyone, but within that transition of a young person going from children's services to adult services, there's a lot of transitioning happening for everybody in the system, which complicates things. And then to add to that is a neurodevelopmental condition in which transitions are very anxiety provoking. What you might see is a different child, essentially, or young person, not a child, young person, that, you know, might kind of confuse the system. And you know, it's a very, very challenging time. I'm not sure what the question was. That those are my reflections. Sorry.
No, we haven't even gone into the questions, I don't think.
Oh, okay, that's why there's no, sorry.
It's okay, don't worry. What are some of the specific challenges that individuals face?
Mm.
Um, let me say that again. What's some of the specific challenges that individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities may face during the transition to adulthood? And how can we best support them through these challenges?
Well, it's so varied, I think. It would be quite difficult to answer that question kind of in a kind of like grouped way, because, you know, the nature of just being unique, people will have different diagnoses, and then within those diagnoses, they will have different personalities and presentations. And that will influence where they are in life, what they're doing, and how they might take that overall transition. But I think kind of if we could try to speak broadly, what I've seen is that this phase of, you know, particularly being in mental health services is so fragile in a way that it can be supported by a whole team that's just focused on transitions and managing that transition. So in terms of kind of the practical side of things, there is a need to think about whether somebody who's a child would be, would be eligible to receive adult services, because the criteria is they're different. And what that might mean is that a child would not fit the criteria, and therefore they wouldn't get that same level of support, and we may need to look into other aspects or other avenues for them to get support. And if they are if they do meet the criteria for a service, it might mean that certain things need to be in place, or assessments need to be done, paperwork needs to be clear, so that it's clear that they're eligible for that service, which is just lots of things for the young person to do and for the system to do, which can be challenging. You know, as they're transitioning, you know, off the back of that, there are more meetings to attend, more paperwork to for them to kind of look at and to think about. There might be changes in accessibility to services outside of kind of the support, even sometimes kind of certain kind of where the way that medications are processed can be different. Of course, that, you know, there might be changes in kind of care provision and what that looks like, moving house. So, you know, lots of people can get involved and lots of processes can get involved, and I think that can be overwhelming for anyone. And yeah, particularly if it's a young, you know, a young person as well, and trying to navigate that can be hard work. Yeah.
And there's so many, I feel like there's also a bit of like we're adult social care or we're adult health services, and that was children. Your face says it all.
I'm
Like,
sorry. I'm
no,
sorry.
it's you know, it's like it's so true. And like especially I feel like adult social care, they kind of look down on children's social
Oh.
care. And same thing applies to um in health services as well. I've noticed, and other people have noticed as well who've like turned 18. But one thing that adult social care and child social care have in common is they both want to very much would it, like negatively impact a person's development just so they can save their backs, which is quite common. So put in places so much restriction that is so unnecessary, where safety doesn't even come into place, and but they know because of previous
I
risk
see.
that this is needed,
I see. Mm.
but the risk is old, and if they are not presenting with the same risk, there's no need.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's one thing. Can you provide examples of practical strategies for promoting independence and self-care skills? Oh my God, what I said just in individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities as they transition to adulthood?
Yeah, so differs really, again, thinking about strengths and thinking about areas of difficulty. So I think with learning disability, one key strategy, or one key domain to think about is language and communication. And I think it goes across the board actually as well with neurodevelopmental conditions. But one key strategy is social stories, and trying to find ways to communicate situations and how you can plan kind of how they play out for that person through kind of pictures and stories is just a lovely way to kind of just connect with a person, and also share and teach. So social stories can look like, let's say, I work with younger ones, so toileting can be a thing sometimes. And so you might have a social story where you've got step by step what to do when this young person goes into the bathroom. So let's say their name is Sean. Sean walks into the bathroom, and then you might have a picture of the door or a picture of the toilet there. And then you might have Sean closes the door, and then you might have a picture of the door closed there. Sean pulls down his pants, etc., etc., with pictures to go with it. And the idea is that you go through that with the young person, ideally through play. So you might make it with them, you might use pictures of them so it's quite engaging and fun. You might use characters that they like. And these days you can get pictures from so many different places for personal use, so you can create a social story if you're that way inclined, or just cut things out, and make a social story with your young person. And if they're engaged in the process and it's fun, it just contributes towards a positive memory. And what's better than getting the social kind of time and the social engagement from somebody that you are close to. So in putting that together, hopefully there's some learning that happens there and some sort of connection to it, a motivation to do it. And you might want to couple that with kind of an actual reward. Why not? Everybody likes a reward. So that's something that you could do to support people with neurodevelopmental conditions and a learning disability. And you can adapt that. So social story doesn't have to be so prescriptive. It depends on what's needed, or it could be that it's a Makaton signs only and no words. It depends on whether that's where they are in terms of their development. But for an older person, having a social story might look like just talking through kind of the if they've kind of I don't know, asked a question. If it's someone with ADHD and they've asked a question before they thought it through, it might be worth talking through what other questions they could have maybe addressed beforehand, to get to so that they could answer their own question in a compassionate and non-judgmental, not condescending way, of course. But these are also social stories, or just supporting that person to understand the social nuances of things. With ASD, again, just explaining things, like just explaining things is just so helpful, just to shine a light on what's happening and how other people might be perceiving it, or how it might differ, to how exploring how their idea of it might differ, that kind of thing. So yeah, social stories and just supporting kind of people being in the know about these social rules can be super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Social rules, because they change too. Oh yeah, you do that, but in this situation, and because of this and this, you do it maybe this way. And it's like, oh yes, that was not such a rule after all. So, yeah.
Sorry, I just found that relatable. Can you discuss any research or studies that highlight effective interventions or programs for supporting the overall well-being of individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities during the transition to adulthood?
So, I think I'm not completely like able to reel off the research in terms of kind of statistics and things. But in terms of kind of, and it depends on the kind of the presentation. So in terms of kind of research, what kind of presentation are you thinking about? Mental health? Are you thinking about behavior? Because there's different, I guess.
Like in the transition, what is proven?
Oh, transition specifically, sorry. So yeah, I don't know of any specific research, and that's a good point to look that up, in terms of kind of what works, and thinking about kind of anything that's been randomized, or even just a case study would be a good one. So yeah, I don't know. But one of the things that sort of models that are drawn on are kind of like a professionals a case conference kind of model. So having everyone who's involved in one room, including the identified client, so the young person or the person who's transitioning, and a representative or an IMCA, I think it's called, an advocate, and everybody is able to kind of have an agenda beforehand, prepare notes, prepare paperwork that they're going to bring, get some time, to make sure that the identified client has a voice that's already been kind of talked about, so that they feel comfortable being in the space as much as is possible, because it's a very intimidating space for everyone, and having kind of a case conference, so talking about what was discussed last time, any progress that's been made, and addressing anything that needs to be done, and then setting kind of new goals and a plan really for what needs to happen next, with a view to those things being done hopefully by the next meeting, and setting another meeting. So in terms of a framework, we kind of work with that. I think there is also there's also, it's tricky, because there's also a lot about kind of relationships and attachments, and endings that come up, that I think would be really useful to explore, with the young person, if they are having kind of that one-to-one mental health or counselling support, and maybe even kind of transition meetings. So if they are having somebody from a new team that they're going to be having mental health support from, having a joint meeting, or a meeting between the two professionals if the young person doesn't want to be in that meeting, so that things can be discussed and handed over. Yeah, those kinds of things in theory would be helpful.
Um, are there any specific support networks or organizations that provide guidance and resources for those individuals during the transition to adulthood?
Within the services I've worked in, we have kind of provided information to people who are transitioning, and we were quite mindful in creating this information, in attending kind of a training around creating easy read documents. It's so beautiful, actually, to be able, it's a very, skilled thing to be able to write things in a very clear way, I think. Yeah, I think that there is information out there about how to put these things together, and tailoring the information that's shared for the specific process that that person's going through. There's a lot of room to have those resources maybe up and running, but then the capability to come together to make sure that they have the right, for example, if there's pictures on there, to make sure that the pictures of the clinicians are the right people, or if there's any kind of specific pathways or people that they need to know about, that only those people are on there, not just everyone, if that makes sense. That's the kind of thing that we've done within our teams before.
Can you discuss any legal rights or accommodations that individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities are entitled to during transitions to adulthood?
Yeah, so they would be covered by the mental health, the Equality Act. So any adjustments that they need in the process would need to be considered. I would really hope that, considering they were being transitioned, if it were from one learning disability team or a neurodevelopmental team to another, that would be really high up on the agenda in how things would be put together. I would imagine, I would really hope it would be, because we would be kind of supporting that person to be as engaged in the process, and to have a proper say in what happens as much as possible. And so when we do meetings, where the meetings are held, how they're framed, and how long they are, I would hope that would be kind of built around the person who's going to be transitioned as well.
How can we address the stigma and misconceptions surrounding neurodivergent conditions and learning disabilities to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for individuals during the transition to adulthood?
Sorry, the first part of that question, what was it again? Sorry.
I need to get it up. Sorry. I think, how do you? I need to get it up. Sorry.
It's like my brain can only, like, it's so it's limited in terms of the information it can hold. I'm just, yeah.
It's okay.
Was it the communication? I think it was communication. A stigma.
No, how can we address the stigma and misconceptions surrounding ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities, create a more inclusive and supportive environment?
It's a really interesting question, because in highlighting ADHD and autism, there is a need to highlight the difficulties that are present, or the ways that people might think differently. And so there's a real need to be so careful around the language. I think that's why I was thinking about that. You said language, because I was thinking about language. There's a real need to be very careful about the language that's being used. So, using kind of really affirmative, neuroaffirmative language. So, thinking about, people's strengths, or framing things, experiences, in terms of kind of facts, or ways that they can be seen as positive. So saying he asks a lot of questions, or he's always talking, might have kind of connotations around it that are negative, but being able to reframe that as curious and inquisitive doesn't have the same ring to it. So using it as language that's kind of kind of more positive, um, can go a long way. I'm just trying to think about what the question was. It was about stigma and how we might be able to reduce stigma. I think, you know, it I think what we're seeing is that neurodevelopmental conditions are not so uncommon, actually. So if there was kind of more of a no, I'm going to say less of an othering, around neurodevelopmental conditions, and more of a kind of clarity around, that it's not, it doesn't, having a neurodevelopmental condition doesn't have to be disabling. It's quite often the environment that is disabling, and having that narrative kind of a bit clearer could also help, because I think that part of the stigma can come from wanting people with a neurodevelopmental condition to fit in to how things are meant to be. And if we can see that things are, and that they don't have to be, they can change, then we can see opportunities. So going back to, the example I brought earlier, where, you've got somebody who they're, again, me thinking about neuroscience, their rhythms are telling them that they need to get up and move around every 10 minutes as opposed to every half an hour, like some other children in your class. So by understanding that that's what their body rhythm within their brain and their body is telling them, and reframing that from he always gets out of his chair to Sean, can you get some pens and hand them around to the class? All of a sudden Sean's being helpful, and and that's through changing the environment. Now the environment requires that Sean he gets up to help, which is okay for Sean because he's good for doing that anyway. Ask another child, they'd be like, no. And you wouldn't ask that child, you'd maybe think of another thing that works for that child. So yeah, being able to kind of see that the environment can be shifted, and being creative and open towards that, I think would help with a lot of the shifting of that stigma, because we can then give rise and give space to people's gifts and diversity and differences. You never know, you might have someone delivering pens, you have someone delivering pieces of paper, someone wiping the whiteboard, and you'll be as a teacher kicking back just teaching. Do you know what I mean? So it can really change the environment and the experience for people.
Sorry. I'm just like thinking about next. Yeah, that was it. I don't know why I was thinking about something else. So we're gonna now move on to how trauma impacts neurodivergent individuals. So we'll explore the intricate relationship between trauma and conditions such as ADHD, ASD, and learning disabilities, or uncover the unique challenges faced by neurodivergent individuals, and discuss strategies for providing support and healing. So, how does trauma impact the executive functioning abilities of individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
Yeah, so I think we covered earlier the kind of way that our threat response can, maybe we did, maybe we didn't. If we didn't, let me just quickly recap. So when we experience kind of stressful stimuli or information or something that kind of makes us feel like we're going to die or be very seriously hurt, it sets off a cascade of hormones being released into our system, which also reroutes the way that our brain processes information. So and I guess the kind of, if we're going to think like about the adaptive function of that as kind of human beings, where the brain reroutes for keeping itself safe. So it pushes out kind of hormones, adrenaline, and later on kind of stress hormones, but it also reroutes the way that our brains are processing information, and kind of avoids kind of the areas of the brain that help us to connect kind of meanings and nuances to our memories. So we're very it kind of goes straight into our kind of I think the area of the brain is called the entorhinal cortex in the brain, or the hippocampus, and it gets kind of stored there without this kind of processing that happens. And so, there are memories that get stored in the memory that are kind of untidy, as it were. So, I've heard this analogy where when people experience a trauma, things go into their memories in kind of like as like floating bits of paper, and it's kind of like somebody's just gone into your memory and just thrown up a whole bunch of papers, and all of the different parts of the memory are kind of blocked or not blocked, but they're kind of just not filed away neatly, so things come back and they don't make sense as much. And so yeah, as a consequence of this kind of cascade of hormones happening, and the memories being a bit hazy, and maybe even like some long-term injury, if that, something that's happened, or or physical injury that's happened, the combination of those things means that that person's nervous system and brain functioning and recall of memories is kind of given a bit of a shock, and operate slightly differently. So you might get somebody who now has flashbacks because of those kind of unprocessed kind of memories, which are they can be terrifying. That then makes the cascade of hormones more likely to go off, or people might be more hypervigilant. Generally speaking, that becomes a pattern in life, which means that threat response is more likely to be turned on. So that means that later experiences might also get rerouted through via not via that processing, which means there's more memories that get stored that are thrown up in the air and not so filed away. And added to all of this is with neurodevelopmental conditions, that the brain is functioning differently to process social information. So without the typical ways of functioning and being in place, and then layered on top of that an additional need for people with neurodevelopmental conditions to analyze situations and to go through the memory to think about how to operate in certain situations, because they're having to learn to operate in a way that's counterintuitive sometimes. The whole process can become really overwhelming in terms of brain capacity, and then not being able to perform it again can trigger off the threat system. So it can become a real feedback loop. And in all of this, the frontal lobe is where kind of executive functioning sits, I guess, but it's fed by the frontal lobe, and executive functioning is fed by the rest of the brain and what it's doing at that time. And so pulling together kind of the right bits of information in those files is very hard for the executive functioning and the prefrontal cortex to do, because they're all thrown up in the air, or the threat system's going off over there and taking up some resources. So I can't properly focus on what's being said. So it can become a real sticky and very unpleasant stuck situation for people with neurodevelopmental conditions. Yeah.
What are the potential long-term effects of trauma on the social and emotional development for individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities?
Well, yeah, it will be, I mean, one of the things that really stand out for me are kind of life choices. I think going through a trauma and then needing to come to a place where you're ready to unpack and file away some of those memories is a process and a journey that takes time and can restrict people in terms of what they feel safe to explore. And so, depending on when the trauma happens, there is a need to take some space to do that work, even whether people want to or not. Sometimes you just need to take time out after being in a traumatic experience, and that can vary in terms of time. And so while somebody else who hasn't been through a trauma is doing other things, somebody who has all this work to do, because of the thing that's happened. And as I say, that can vary in terms of how much that affects their life. But typically there comes a point where, people might want to work through that, or they're noticing that it's affecting areas of their life. And so when I think about kind of the effects of a trauma on people with neurodevelopmental conditions, and I think about stigma, and I think about feelings of isolation, I'm thinking about self-esteem, and that, being impacted by their experiences. I think about, what the impact of that has on somebody being able to pursue their dreams and their goals with conviction. Now, I have to caveat that, because obviously always looking at the positives, because there are people that have done so much for this world, and arguably their neurodevelopmental condition has led them on the way, whether you agree with them or not. Greta Thunberg is a very good example. Elon Musk is another very good example of people with neurodevelopmental condition. And I'm sure there's countless, I mean, I know there's countless that have been able to withstand a lot, but look at where they are in terms of making an impact on the world. So, it just goes to show really that, traumas and, things that happen to us are awful, and they can set us back. But if we can create environments where people can see glimmers of hope, or progress, or work to their strengths. Let's face it, we all have things going on, but if we can work to our strengths, there are areas of life that we can all thrive in, and we can see examples of that. So if we can do more of that work where helps people to work through those things and see their strengths, it'd be great.
In what way does trauma influence the learning and educational experiences of individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions?
The learning experiences.
Yeah.
Mm. Hmm. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that for people with a neurodevelopmental condition, like autistic people, I feel have automatically more on their plates. Like it's like, okay, you got to learn this, and you got to learn this, and you got to learn this. So yeah, that's a thing, I think. There's more to learn, because these, social rules, and when they do and don't apply, it's very intricate. Um, um, but I think, in terms of kind of the specifics around kind of learning disabilities, there may be, particular areas that might be difficult. So, thinking about, sometimes understanding things verbally might be hard. So having things presented as pictures where possible, and then treating verbal comprehension as though it's, the difficulty level that it is, and then giving it, the time that it needs, or breaking things down, particularly in that domain. So not neglecting it, but just making sure that the challenges in that area are not going to slow down progress in other areas. So yeah, thinking about that kind of thing in ADHD. I think that there are really kind of polarized opposites in terms of kind of when things are really interesting. There can be like a real intensity in learning about this thing. Whereas when things are not, there's just the opposite. And so, trying to frame things, but also keeping them fresh for a child with ADHD or a person with ADHD. So doing things, the same thing, but in different ways, can really help with the learning. But I think doing things monotonously, in a classic classroom environment where you have to sit down in a row, not really moving around or engaging the body much, probably would be a barrier to learning for people with ADHD. And I think it's a similar story for people with autism. Although again, if there's a specialist topic that an autistic person knows about, often that can be really detailed, and it can learn a lot from that. And yeah, in terms of learning, it may be around kind of just being kind of collaborative in sharing kind of social perspectives. And sometimes people aren't kind of aware of the social rules that they themselves are following, to then be aware that someone is not following them, or maybe they're aware that someone's not following them, but they don't really understand or see it in that way. And so kind of that can be a barrier as well, not really knowing that it's important for that to be explained, or for there to be a dialogue, a conversation about how that situation played out and how it could be perceived by different people in the situation. Yeah.
But one weird thing that I learned recently, like a few months ago, was the my ADHD and ASD, as well as my trauma, creates a dyslexic-like response. And that was really crazy, because I was like, you know what, I really struggle with writing and stuff like that when it comes to like spelling, but I type most of the time, so that helps.
There you go.
And I was like, oh my God, I feel like I don't have the stereotypical symptoms, but I do have other situations. But it turns out it's my autism, ADHD, and trauma
Overlapping, and then
yeah
it just presents. And that's
like,
the uniqueness. That is the uniqueness. It's so important to see all of the different aspects.
and
Thanks for
it's
sharing that.
so, I feel like I feel like the thing is, a lot of people I in education, especially when they're in specialist provisions, they feel quite hopeless, because everything, they might be a year behind or something like that, but everything is taking more effort, more time. It's like, to get one piece of work done, there might be like 10 crises.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
like, before you have paragraph one down,
Yeah.
because I think that's the case with me.
Yeah.
And it's like so frustrating. But even though, like, I got my English when I was what, six, I think I was 15 when I got my English done. Doesn't sound right. 16 when I got my English GCSEs done.
Yeah.
And then I'm 18 now, and on Monday, I did my math functional skills. So like, it's never like
Well done.
Oh, thank you.
No. Oh no. Oh, definitely not. No. You work at the pace. There are things and structures in place, but it doesn't fit for everybody. It just doesn't. It can't work for everybody. Yes,
No.
it might work for the majority, and people will have to find ways to flex within that. Everybody has to. But yeah. Well done.
Thank you.
Got that hopefully out of the way.
Hopefully I pass. It's just, I feel like it is like, if, let's just say, I passed this math functional skills, it took me 6 years to get 2 GCSEs done. And that's all you need. And nobody looks at that when you're like,
Who's counting, really? Yeah.
And I feel like this is why a lot of people who would want to pursue education in a higher level wouldn't, because they're like, you know what, this took me 6 years. How long is it going to take me to do a degree? How long is it going to take me to do A levels?
Yeah.
If I have,
get it.
like, I feel like the only GCSE that you need, I feel like maybe it's your English, because that's what you use a lot, and depending on what career you do. If you want to be a pharmacist, I think you need your maths. But like,
Yeah.
but
You'd eventually get your maths.
Yeah, I don't think it should be you need to have two um GCSEs to do your A levels. I find that absolutely ridiculous.
These criteria, yeah, the criteria. I know, but it's tricky. I guess I'm thinking from the perspective of an organization, and I'm thinking about their responsibility to make sure that, because I guess at college stage they stand back, isn't it, a bit more. So it's kind of like, oh, we want to make sure that when this person comes, we have the resources enough to support them for success. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? Sometimes the way that the system is in place, that kind of step back at A level stage, maybe it's something that they don't offer, but it's something that would just help somebody along the way and they would still, do the same test at the end. But because the organization doesn't have that set up, it's like they have to set these barriers or these kind of criteria to flag things. And it's I think that it's hard because, it's kind of like what you were saying about how many years it took you to do your maths. And in my mind, part of me is thinking, yeah, who's counting? Because you've done it, and that's the most important thing. But then at the same time, it's like, well, actually, like, everyone, society is counting. Like, we're looking at how old we are, we're celebrating our, a lot of us celebrate birthdays every year. And you've got people that you started off with that you kind of want to be on par with them, or you're looking at other people around the same age as you. And to a person, it does matter. It feels a certain kind of way. So yeah, it just got me thinking about that.
I feel like the one way that I am is like I have my life planned out ever since I was younger. I had my every little aspect of my life planned out, even and it gets reviewed,
Yeah.
quarterly as well,
Okay.
and I still do that.
Not
And
bad. That's not a bad shout, to be fair. It's a good one.
yeah, and I turned 18, and I was like, I'm not gonna get married. I mean, I'm not gonna get engaged at 21. I'm not gonna get married at 25. Have my first child at 26.
Mm,
I'm
yeah.
not going to, it's like I was like,
Yeah. Yeah. And then when you look back on it, because you've got
and
your
I'm like,
records probably.
yeah, oh, I do have records, yes, as well.
Yeah.
Oh, trust me,
Yeah.
I have all my paperwork in printed out, papered, filed. I
Yeah.
really do have a problem, but that's the iconic part.
Yeah. As long as, listen, if it doesn't hold you back, is it? It's just not a problem unless it's a problem, is it?
That's true.
If you're falling over them and nearly hurting yourself, then that's different. But if they're all filed away, it's your
Yeah.
space.
The worst thing is when you're behind filing and then you are falling over the papers.
When you're pine filing,
Behind filing. So
behind filing, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yes,
because if you, oh my God, if you think about my network is really, really big. It's
I
like
can only imagine.
significantly, I would like to say significantly, but it is reduced now that I've turned 18. But
Mm.
I had a care home. I saw my brother, so I have a contact supervisor. I would have
Oh,
my social worker. I had my PA. I still have my PA. Um, I have like I see the consultant psychiatrist from Merton every 2 weeks. I see a psychologist twice a week. And all these paperwork just build up the lack reviews, the
yeah.
the HCP planning, everything just piles up. And I don't want to. I will definitely request my file, but I don't
Mm,
want some redacted
mm,
file
mm,
when I turn like when I actually get them.
mm. You got your own original,
Yeah,
file system. I tell you, that's very good skills because there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of emails. I'm kind of thinking of get some advice. Maybe after this.
what are the unique challenges faced by individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions when it comes to processing and coping with traumatic experiences?
Yeah. So it makes me think about you know, the experience of people with some people with experience thoughts as kind of like loud noises, or some autistic people experience them as loud noises or loud people talking, sometimes with different voices, not in a way that's in any way kind of related to psychosis. It's just the way that they're experienced. And that's what came into my mind straight away, which kind of dovetails into a kind of thought process about sensory experiences and sensitivities and hyposensitivity, hypersensitivity. And coupling that with the threat response that is trained to go off in people who have had a traumatic experience with the goal of keeping that person safe, and it's often like involuntary and hyper vigilant, so it's more likely to go off and you can't control it, and it might be more amplified as well. So thinking about that kind of like sensory sensitivity and hypersensitivity, what that might have looked like for the person who has a neurodevelopmental condition predating the traumatic experience, and then how the traumatic comes in to kind of rewrite that, makes me think about how overwhelmingly overloading the world can be for somebody who's experiencing like an episode, like a flashback, or going through a highly anxiety provoking situation. The threat system is likely to be firing at all cylinders. And another thing that I didn't mention is that in the nature of keeping the self safe in that threat response happening is this kind of like more openness to, or more receptiveness to, facial features or sounds or things that are moving in the periphery anyway. So that's another thing to say that that's amplified, that's turned on, because the brain thinks that it's not safe, so it needs to, if anybody's moving over there, I need to know, because I need to make sure I defend myself or run or shout or scream or whatever. And so all of those things together can contribute towards this sensory overload that happens again, frequently, more intensely, and in a way that is very difficult to switch off.
I feel like then I feel like once you experience trauma and you have neurodivergence, it like your window is significantly reduced as well. It's
window of tolerance, like, of things. Yeah. The comfort zone gets really small, and then the kind of growth zone, the things that are challenging, usually they're things that you might have before been able to just do without even thinking about it. I see that.
What interventions and strategies can be effective in supporting individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities who have experienced trauma?
So I'm personally not kind of trauma trained, but I know of CBT for trauma, and there's a process of in a kind of very gentle, in a procedural way, in a very contained way, with strategies put in place to recenter and to reassociate and to get grounded, going through and unpacking those experiences, and finding ways to make sense of them so that they can be, in a way, filed away. So if you have that kind of analogy in your mind about going into the brain and throwing up files of paper and then being everywhere, it's about kind of saying, okay, let's go to this corner of the room and pick up all these bits of paper and let's have a quick look at them. And then naturally that can be overwhelming, so it's about kind of really walking a line between that challenge, but also containment and centering and grounding, and being supported in doing that. And then, I believe I'm not sure of the evidence base around EMDR, eye movement, rap eye movement desensitization
I think it's
response, eye movement desensitization response,
I think so.
EMDR, which is a kind of it's a kind of it looks different to how therapy typically looks. It's a combination between a therapist who's specially trained, supporting you and guiding you in moving your eyes in particular to particular points, and then exploring certain sensations or experiences when your eyes are in that particular point. And it has a good evidence base for being helpful in terms of reducing the impact of kind of trauma, and supporting people to work through trauma. So I would imagine that those kind of therapies would be sort of trauma focused and trauma specialized
She got
therapies.
funding from she was like very like overwhelmed one day. She went for a walk and she was looking at clouds and she was like, oh my god, I'm so much calmer. And that's how she got funding to do more research. And I'm like, if I was on the panel, I'd be like, you looked at clouds. And yeah,
Oops, my phone's ringing now. Yeah, I hear you. I know. Hello, can you hear me?
me.
Oh, I can't hear you. I think it's because my hello?
Hello?
Yeah, it was because it was ringing. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah. There we
I would
go.
be like, yeah, maybe. Oh, somebody says they looked at clouds and it made me feel better, and they're like, and I'd be like, great, that works for you, great. But then to go get funding and on that basis,
I'm not familiar with the exact history, but that sounds like a funny story. Oh
and I
dear.
feel like I think she's dead now. I don't know why. I don't know why I said it like that. So I'm sure she's not sharing it with her friends. Maybe upstairs. Sorry. How can we promote autism acceptance and understanding in schools and communities?
How can we support autism acceptance in
How can
schools
we
and
promote
communities?
autism acceptance and understanding in schools and communities?
Hmm. You know what comes into my head? All the wonderful ways that we support, we celebrate people from other marginalized communities. So, at the moment I think we have an autism awareness day. I'm not sure we have a week. Is it a week? It could be a week. But, really, really kind of promoting that. I feel terrible because I can't remember. But really promoting that and making the most of that, maybe having kind of more presence of that around. Also thinking about kind of maybe other neurodevelopmental conditions and having kind of a week around that. Thinking about celebrating the ideas of people who have had this way of thinking. Um, um, uh, yeah, and maybe doing things a little bit more, how people with neurodevelopmental conditions like to do them so that people can feel it out, because it often feels good. It's really nice if we could focus on something that we really like doing, whatever that is. That feels really nice. So if people can, get a sense of what that feels like, that would be great. So yeah, I think maybe tapping into kind of a bit more of a lived experience and then sharing that a bit more, with people who don't have a neurodevelopmental condition.
Perfect. Um, how I don't even think it's a how question. Um, what are some effective strategies for supporting neurodivergent children with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities in the classroom?
So yeah, I spoke of one. I think one of the things that I like the idea of is having maybe like a group within a group. So you have children with neurodevelopmental conditions who are part of a wider classroom, learning with everybody else, as why not? And then but within the classroom there might be children who might have specific needs, so making sure that they're doing similar work but maybe tiering it, or thinking about adaptations to it. So maybe someone with ADHD might need it to be on the computer instead of kind of in writing. Someone might prefer to have a quiet space to do their work, so having quiet space maybe in a different part of the classroom might be helpful. So thinking about adaptations like that are really specific to kind of their needs, I think it can be helpful to really kind of consider sensory needs, because I think those in particular can be difficult to turn down and to navigate as a person with a neurodevelopmental condition. So exploring what those sensory needs are, and then trying to find ways to satisfy them, which then can hopefully make space for learning.
Sorry,
Did I?
Yeah, you have. I'm just like, I'm a bit distracted because I just saw an email coming in and I was like,
Oh,
this is going to frustrate me.
oh yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on current DSM criteria for diagnosing neurodivergent conditions? Are there any changes or improvements you would suggest?
Oh, that's yeah. The criteria. Yeah, I mean it's just notoriously hard to assess for neurodevelopmental conditions because of how they differ, or how presentation differs, and it's also so and that means that it can be a lengthy process for somebody. The knock-on impact of that basically is that it slows down how quickly people can become diagnosed or get diagnosed and then get support based off of the diagnosis. So I don't know, it's a very tricky one because there needs to be a criteria. So I agree with it in that respect, but sometimes there's multiple processes that need to go through to ensure that you have enough information to make the diagnosis, which is important in terms of kind of just making sure that we've got it right. I think when the diagnosis is given, sometimes it can be helpful, but it doesn't fully explain the needs. And I think that the DSM criteria does have kind of some ways of specifying how much support might be needed for somebody with ASD, or how much, or the particular subtype of ADHD, whether it's hyperactive or inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, or inattentive. But in and of itself, that it doesn't give us enough information as to what the young person needs is. And when a diagnosis is made, it's always supported with recommendations that go alongside, but sometimes the diagnosis is what carries rather than the recommendation. So you can tell someone that the child has autism, or that it's an autistic child, but you don't necessarily reel off the recommendations or the specific characteristics, or even things that might be really prominent, like that they have a specialist interest in trains, for example. That doesn't necessarily go alongside. That can be tricky when it comes to diagnostic criteria as well.
Finally, what's one thing that you're grateful for today?
Oh, what a nice question. Oh man, let me think. What's one thing that I'm grateful for? So many things, but I'm really grateful to be in this space. I think in the nature of the conversation we're having, I'm thinking about my career, and just grateful to be in this space with you. I do a lot of social media, and at Dr. Melody Smith as a plug, you never know. And I put on my stories today that I should get it up, but I basically said I'm meeting with you and that I'm learning so much from you about podcasts, from doing this podcast with you. And so I'm really grateful to be in a position where I can kind of say something. I've got to say, like when I was first thinking about doing the podcast, it's kind of daunting, isn't it? Because nobody knows everything, and imposter syndrome is it's a real thing. It's there, and it's present in all of us, to some degree, I would imagine. But there is real kind of um wonderful things that come from kind of just going a bit outside of your comfort zone. And I think from our conversations, it's really helped me to kind of see where there are some gaps in my knowledge, but also I just have done so much work. And so, where I can be helpful to people. And I think this is a point that I really can own, that I think that it's not unique to where I'm at in my stage of my career. I think at every stage of everyone's life and career, they can own what they know because they know stuff that they didn't know last year. And there's always someone that they could probably teach who hasn't done the things that they have done in some way. But I think that where I'm at now, I kind of have a capacity to kind of just look back on my career and have tangible examples of how there's things that I've done and can give back. So I'm really happy to reflect on kind of being able to give information, through kind of years of just working hard and trying to help people along the way.
And I've just looked and your post
It's
is so cute.
I wasn't expecting you to go on there. I don't know why. Well, I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, you see what I said? I said like, oh my gosh, because it's true. I'm learning so much. Like, and just the thinking process that happens before, and thinking about, yeah, it's great that we did it over 2 sessions as well, because I could reflect on
I love seeing your
last time.
daughter's toys behind you. It's very cute.
The unicorn. I know. It's my little buddy keeping me company.
Wrapping up this episode, I want to thank you for joining me on this whole journey. It's been 2 days. So let's
Yeah.
of exploring the impact of trauma on individuals with ADHD, ASD, or learning disabilities. We've discussed strategies for supporting their unique needs, the power of early intervention, embracing neurodiversity and strength, mental health challenges, and enhancing education and navigating the transition to adulthood. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Oh, thank you for having me.
it's okay. Oh my god,
Thank you.
it's such an amazing time.
Oh, me too.
Oh my god.